Now here's something that was shown by Dr. Kazumasa Nomoto of Sony at the Society for Information Displays Display Week in 2014. And it's this Pentagon that shows 5 parameters of higher picture quality, spatial resolution, temporal resolution, contrast, color gamut, and quantization. And it has little tick marks on it so that under spatial resolution, the one at the top, you can see that we start with a quarter of VGA resolution, then standard definition, then 2K, which is roughly high definition, then 4K, and then 8K, as though these all progress at the same rate. And by the way, audio also counts. So on the left, you can see audio quality progressing from AM to FM to CD to Super CD. And on the right, you can see the immersive field progressing from mono to stereo to 5.1 channel surround to full immersive sound, including on top and so on. By the way, I'm not going to really talk anymore about audio, but it is significant. I've participated in experiments myself in which people thought the picture got larger as the audio improved. So why are we talking about higher spatial resolution at all? Well, it seems that 2020 vision demands it. Let's take a look at a movie theater. This graphic was created by Ari, and it shows that even at the very, very back row of the movie theater, people with 2020 vision can perceive 3K of resolution or beyond HD, 50% more than HD. And towards the back of the theater, they can perceive 4K of resolution, and closer to the screen, they can perceive 8K of resolution. And so how can we possibly get away with HD? Well, that's what seems to be the case. But if we look at a list of the top box office movies from last year, 2013, the #1 movie, Hunger Games, was shot on film. The #2 movie, Iron Man 3, was shot with the Ari Alexa. Then Frozen was animated, Despicable Me 2 was animated, Man of Steel was shot on film, Monsters University was animated, and then Gravity, again, shot on the Ari Alexa. Now, the Ari Alexa's resolution is 2880 by 1620, or less than 3K. So if you take the top 7 movies of 2013, not one of them was shot with a camera that was either 4K or beyond. Here is an image from one of the Spider-Man movies, and this was provided courtesy of Pete Boudet, and his point is that in the top computer animated movies, the computer animation is rendered in 2K, so there is no 4K resolution, even if some other part of the movie was shot in 4K or dealt with in 4K otherwise. So the blockbuster movies are not being released in 4K. And here is an image from NAB in 2014 from the Ericsson booth. This was shot by Peter Putman. And a common question that people ask when they see these 4K images is that 4K? Because it doesn't seem like they can tell just by looking at it. Even though it's got a sign on it, this one says true 4K, P at 60 frames per second. Now, this is not a new issue. If you go back to 1928 at the Berlin radio show, which then became the International Funkausstellung, or the International Radio Show, or the Consumer Electronics Show of Europe, if you will, there was a new form of television that was being introduced. It was still electromechanical television, but it had 96 scanning lines instead of 30 scanning lines. And so the people were showing the difference between the two numbers of scanning lines to say, look how much better the 96 is than the 30. And there's no question, if you look at these two images, that the 96 looks a lot better than the 30. But now I'm going to show you an actual off-screen 30-line photo. And it looks an awful lot better than that demonstrated 30 line, which was to show how much better the 96 line is. And you could say, well, yes, the aspect ratio is different, and so the size is different. So I've now shrunk the 30 line image to be more like the actual off-screen photo, and I think you can still see that the actual off-screen photo looks a lot better. And in fact, you might have a hard time determining which is better between the 30 line and the 96 line. Now that's pretty crude pictures. That's nowhere near what we're talking about when we talk about HD and 4K. Now I would like to caution you about the methodology in this particular webinar. I can't possibly properly show you here resolution, frame rate, dynamics, or color, because I don't know what you're looking at, even if I had a wonderful channel to you. Another caution, the source material matters tremendously, so I could choose source material that would be very favorable to high dynamic range or high frame rate, or maybe even to higher static resolution. The viewing conditions matter tremendously, the screen size, the display, and especially the distance from the screen. Now at the right, I'm showing a typical old viewing situation, and this was surveyed by the late Bernie Lechner of RCA Laboratories, and he found that people sat approximately 9 feet from their screens regardless of the screen size, and that's because that's how living rooms were laid out, and the furniture and so on. And if anything, now that the TV set has become thinner, people are probably sitting a little bit farther from their screens. Now here is supposedly an image of 4K from 40,000 feet. And I think you will agree that 4K looks exactly the same as standard definition if you can even see a TV set down there. So grant me that there is some distance where the difference between 4K and HD doesn't matter at all. Now, home viewing distance gets a little more complicated. People could say, well, you sit 9 feet from the screen, or 10 feet from the screen, or 2.7 meters, or 3 meters. But even if you sit a fixed distance from the screen, you're going to move your body. And there's a considerable difference between a relaxed position and an excited position. The green line that you see in those pictures to the left is a yardstick, or approximately a meter. So there's almost a meter difference between watching in a relaxed position and watching in an excited position. And another issue is that when people go shopping for TVs, they are always closer to the screen than they are going to be when they're doing home viewing. So here's a portion of the NHK booth, the Japan Broadcasting Corporation, at the NAB show this year in April, and they're showing an 8K display in this case, but notice the footprints on the floor. That's where they want you to stand. Now, if there was a couch in that place, your knees would probably be hitting the cabinet underneath the screen. So 4K, what is 4K? Well, according to the European Broadcasting Union, it's 4 degrees above absolute zero. They say that if you discuss the resolutions, you should use a small k rather than a capital K, but I'm using the common convention of the capital K. But it could mean 4096 by 3072, or 4096 by 2048, or 4096 by 2160, or even 3840 by 2160, which some people call quad HD because it's the equivalent of 4 HD screens butted up against each other. And some people also use the term UHD, or ultra high definition. But the same term UHD is also used for 7680 by 4320, which some people would call 8K, and it's also used sometimes for systems that include higher frame rates, higher dynamic range, wider color gamut, and immersive sound. And what is a 4K camera? Is a single color-filtered 4K sensor truly 4K? And how many pixels do you need on that sensor? Some people say you only need 8, and some people are providing as many as 20 in a 4K camera. So here's a common HD field camera and lens, the sort of thing that you would use at a sporting event. And going from the right to the left, first we have a long-range zoom lens. This one happens to be a Fujinon 101 times zoom. Then there's a very, very standardized optical mount, BTA S1005A. Then there's some optical filtering. Then there's a dichroic prism with 3 identical resolution sensors on that prism, one for the red, one for the green, and one for the blue image. Now let's examine each of those elements one at a time. So here are 2 new lenses that were introduced by Fujinon this year. On the left is a PL mount lens of the sort that would be used on a 4K camera. And this one has a range from 25 millimeters to 300 millimeters, or 12:1. That is the longest range zoom for a PL mount camera at the moment. And the equivalent for a typical video camera with a B4 mount, the mount that I showed before, would be 12 by 9.8. Now on the right, I'm showing a B4 mount lens, much more easy to hand hold than the other. It's much smaller, it's much lighter, and the equivalent on that one is from 14 millimeters to 254 millimeters. It's an 18 times zoom. It gets much wider than the PL zoom and gets almost as tight. Now, what happens if you want to use one of those long studio field lenses? So in this slide I'm showing on the left a long zoom lens. This one's a 99:1 zoom lens. The equivalent would be 22 to 2132, so the wide end is a little bit wider than that PL mount lens that I was showing you before, but the tight end is tremendously tighter. Now, you can't stick that directly onto a 4K camera. So one of the things you can do is use an adapter of the sort that I'm showing in the middle here, this HD by 35. This one happens to be one that's sold by Able Cine. If that adapter is absolutely perfect, if it has no optical losses whatsoever, it still introduces a 2.6 stop light loss. That's a tremendous amount of light loss. That's like almost the difference between shooting during the day or shooting at night. And this particular adapter is said to compensate for different color depths, and I'll explain that in a moment. And then there are some Sony cameras that have adapters that you can use that are a little bit less lossy, but they work only in the 2K mode of the camera, which is roughly HD, and if you're shooting HD, well, are not using an HD camera. So I mentioned the difference in color depths, and I mentioned that B4 mount is extremely standardized. Here's a diagram of the standard, and notice that the green image plane is right up against the beam splitter block. The blue is 5 microns later, and the red is 10 microns after that. And you wouldn't even expect, given the spectrum, that it should work out that way. You would expect green to be between blue and red, but it doesn't work out that way. It's because the camera and lens manufacturers got together and they said, well, you know, this is the best that we can do, and so this is what you want to design your lenses and your cameras for. So that adapter has to do that same kind of thing. Now, let's look inside a typical zoom lens. There are 4 groups of different elements of glass, and each group has multiple pieces of glass. The first group on the left is for focusing the image. The second group is called the variator. That's what does the zooming or the magnification of the image. The third group is called the compensator. That's what maintains the focus as you zoom. And then the final group is the relay group. That's just for putting the image where it goes. Now notice that that relay group has 7 pieces of glass. And that's for trying to get those colors as close as they can, the red and the green and the blue where they're supposed to be. Now if you stick an adapter after that, that adapter is going to have multiple pieces of glass, because otherwise it's going to introduce chromatic aberrations, and each of those pieces of glass is going to introduce its own distortions, and so it's not that easy to use a long zoom lens on a 4K camera, and even when you do, the lens was designed for HD in the first place and not for 4K. Now here's a new camera that was introduced at NAB this year, the Aliasing, called the 4K camera. And these are images out of their brochure, and I apologize for the little black things in the picture on the right. That's a fault of my scanner. It's not a fault of AJA. And notice that they say that they're including an optical low-pass filter. Well, my question is, how do you optically low-pass when you use a single sensor for 4K? Because here is a picture of the kind of filtering that's done on that sensor. This particular color filter is called a Bayer pattern. It's developed at Kodak, and it's very commonly used. So you have twice as many green filters or green picture elements as you have blue or red. Well, I've divided them out, or the person who did the diagram divided them out up at the top, and you can see that red is only 2K, and blue is only 2K. And green, while it's twice as many as either the red or blue, doesn't give you a true 4K. It gives you something called a quincunx panel. So if you filter this image optically for red or blue, you're doing 2K filtering and you don't have a 4K image. If you filter optically for the green, then you're doing a 4K filtering, and then you're going to introduce aliasing in the red and the blue. So we have a statement down at the bottom from Peter Senton of what was at the time Thompson Grass Valley at NAB 2008, saying that if the DALSA and Red 1, which were 4K cameras at the time, are called 4K cameras, are 4K, then the Panavision Genesis and the Sony F23 are 6K, and those were only called HD cameras at the time. Now, what do these aliases mean? Well, if you blow up something that you've shot with one of your still cameras, you'll probably see something like this. These are color filter artifacts. There are ways of getting rid of these by doing electronic filtering afterwards, but filtering means reducing resolution or reducing contrast, and I will show you in a moment how significant contrast is. Now, it is possible to make a 4K Prism camera, the same as today's HD cameras. There's one at the left side there, was made around 2000 by Lockheed Martin, was presented in the SMPTE journal in 2001. You can see it's quite a large camera because they use really, really, really big image sensors, and one of the reasons that they used such big image sensors is as you go to higher resolution, you make the individual sensors or the individual picture element sensors smaller, and thereby you reduce either the sensitivity or dynamic range depending on how you want to look at it. But it was an excellent camera. It provided terrific results that were very close to film. Now here's a 4K camera prototype that was shown at the NAB show this year. It was from Grass Valley, and it's 3 chips, and it's Prism based. So again, conceivably, it could have been a true 4K camera with 3 4K chips, and there would be no color filtering loss. But in fact, they're using the same sensors as they use in their HD cameras. And so it's actually only an HD camera, except that the system has a 4K output. Now you may say, well, you know, that's cheating, that's terrible, it's not really a 4K camera. But because it doesn't have the color filtering issues of a single sensor, and because all 3 of the colors are uniform, there are advantages to that. And in some ways, they may be able to produce a better image than some of the 4K cameras are. Again, you know, things depend tremendously on what the source material is. Also, because it is a 2/3 inch format camera, it can use B4 lenses with no light loss, but of course getting 4K out of an HD lens is a different issue. So here are some possible benefits of shooting in 4K for generating HD. One, you can reframe in post. You can decide, oh, I really wanted to zoom in more, or I really wanted to frame a little more to the right or left or up or down. You can do image stabilization in post, which I'm showing in the upper image on the right. If you do image stabilization of an HD image, then you lose resolution, but if you do image stabilization of a 4K image, then you're almost guaranteed that you can recover full HD resolution out of that. It's easier to filter 4K. You can consider it oversampling for HD. It's possible to do single sensor 3D, which has certain advantages. That's what I'm showing at the bottom image. And you can get increased sharpness, and I say somewhat on that, and I'll explain that in a moment. Now, here's an indication of why down conversion from 4K can be very good. You have to do some kind of filtering of a sampled signal, and when you shoot something with an image sensor that has multiple picture elements on it, that's a sampled system. And the most basic form of filtering you can do is called a sync function, or a sin x over x function. So this particular curve that I'm showing is a sin x over x function. And the numbers down at the bottom are arbitrary, the numbers from 1 to 11. But if number 11 represents 2160 lines, then the contrast at 1080 lines, or HD, would be 64%. If number 11 represents HD, then the contrast at 1080 lines is 0. And as you can see on the left with that contrast wedge, the difference between 0 and 64% is pretty significant. But here's why extraction of HD from a 4K image, that reframing in post, might not be as good. Now, this curve is not a precise curve. This is just hypothetically some lens. Let's assume that that's what its modulation transfer function looks like, or how much contrast it can deliver at different detail resolutions. So at 0 detail, you're getting 100% of the contrast. And the way I've drawn it here, at HD detail, you're getting about 90% of the contrast. Very, very good. But at the right end of the curve, for this particular curve, I'm showing that at 4K, you're getting less than 40% of the contrast. Well, if that's what's coming through the lens, and then you're extracting HD from that in that area, the right side of the curve between HD and 4K, then you're dealing with much less than HD contrast in your final image. And let's see how important contrast is. Oh, before I do that, here is another camera that was introduced at NAB this year, the Sony Alpha 7S, and it has a very large image sensor. This is a full frame 35. A movie 35 millimeter frame is half the size of this sensor. So you could stick 2 movie sensors, one on top of the other, and then bend them to the right or left, and that would fit in this sensor. And it's only 12 megapixels. Now, because it's only 12 megapixels, it's tremendously sensitive. If you remember film, you would have ISO 100 or ISO 200 or 400, and 800 was considered extremely high-speed film. Well, the equivalent ISO that Sony has given for this camera comes out in 6 figures. So tremendously sensitive. But the reason it's tremendously sensitive is because they did not go to higher than 4K resolution. They went to only 12 megapixels on this enormous sensor. Here's some other stuff that was shown at NAB this year, Blackmagic design. And at the top left, we have the Ursa camera. That's their new digital cinematography camera. Then in the middle is their new studio camera. To the right is the Terran X Express. Down at the bottom left is their new production switcher. The bottom middle is their new routing switcher. And the bottom right are their new 4K processing cards. Well, here's something interesting. All of the things at the top can deal with 12G SDI, or 12 gigabit per second serial digital interface. All of the ones at the bottom can deal only with 6G SDI, or 6 gigabit serial digital interface. So all of the things at the top can handle 4K at 60 frames per second. All of the things at the bottom can only handle 4K at 30 frames per second. And I'll show you in a moment that 4K seems to need a higher frame rate than even HD does. So here's one manufacturer, and they're selling a studio camera and also a studio production switcher, and you can't really connect the camera to the production switcher. So let's recap shooting in 4K. In favor of it, there's down conversion to HD. 100% good. I can't think of anything bad about that. Reframing, stabilizing in post for HD, pretty good, but the problem of the MTF of the lens. Doing stereoscopic 3D HD on one sensor, if you want to do that, that's possible too. Against it, currently less sensitive, no long zooms for the PL mount cameras. There's 8 times the data uncompressed. If we look at HD as being either 720p or 1080i, then 4K spatially is 4 times the number of pixels as 1080i, but it's also progressively scanned, so we need to go from I to P, and that's why it's 8 times. Or if you start with 720, then it's 8 times the spatial pixels. And as you can see, even from those Blackmagic products, there is currently no connection standard, although there are people who are working on that. Now, is there any need to change to 4K? Well, not yet. This was Eutelsat's booth at NAB, and they had this gigantic poster, and the top of the poster says they are broadcasting more than 5,000 TV channels, of which 500 are in high definition. And I'll give you a hint, the other 4,500 are not 4K, even though Eutelsat has done some experiments and has said, oh yes, we can now transmit 4K as well. Now, here are some headlines that appeared in CNET. One says, 3 TV improvements more worthwhile than Ultra HD 4K. And then another one says, the push for Ultra HD 4K forces picture quality trade-offs. So what kind of stuff is being discussed there? Well, now let's move from the camera to the home and see what it's like delivering 4K. So these are some actual viewer tests done by the European Broadcasting Union. They were revealed first at the Hollywood Post Alliance in Technology Retreat in 2013. And other labs around the world have done similar work and have come up with very similar results. So they used 6 different sequences. They showed them on a 56-inch screen to a bunch of viewers, and they had the viewers watch from 2 different distances. One distance was that 2.7 meters or 9 feet, the Lechner distance, how far people sit from their TV screens. That's the red line on these charts. The other distance was 1.5 times the picture height, which is how far you're theoretically supposed to be sitting from a 4K image to be able to see the resolution. And what they found is that there is a significant improvement, it is statistically significant, between 4K and any of the forms of HD that they showed. They tried 720p, 1080i, and 1080p, and 4K was better in each case. But how much better? If people were watching at a standard home viewing distance, or theoretical standard home viewing distance, then their improvement was around 1/3 of a grade, or maybe less than a third of a grade, maybe only a quarter of a grade. And if they were watching from 1.5 times the picture height, which is about 40 inches, a little over 3 feet, or just about 1 meter from the screen for a 56-inch screen, then they got about a half a grade or improvement, maybe a little more than half a grade if it was 720p. That's not a lot. It's an improvement, no question. People who say you can't see 4K are not telling the truth. People can see 4K, the difference, but it's not a huge improvement. So you're getting, let's assume that you're watching at 1.5 times the picture height, you're getting a grade of improvement for 16 times the data rate, because it's 8 times the data rate to get half a grade improvement, so we'll call it 16 times the data rate to get a full grade of improvement. Now, this is a logo of the main standards organization in our business, the Society of Motion Picture and Television Engineers, and I just want to emphasize that there's an M in there. The M stands for motion. We do not watch still pictures, we watch moving pictures. And so when we're talking resolution, even if we're talking spatial resolution, we need to talk not static resolution, but dynamic resolution. So here are some images from a BBC Research white paper. And these were shot with a camera at 300 frames per second, and the camera had essentially no shuttering, so they were able to recreate what it would have looked like if they had shot it at 50 frames per second. And notice that the railroad ties and tracks are identically sharp in the upper and lower picture. But clearly the locomotive is not as sharp, and that's because the locomotive is moving, and we deal with moving images. So here is another picture courtesy of Pete Loudet of Mission Rock Digital, and I don't know what camera this was shot with, but it doesn't really matter. You could call it an HD camera, a 4K camera, it doesn't matter. Everything is blurry in the image. Maybe some parts of the stroller are not quite blurry. So he's pointing out here that there is no 4K information in this image, certainly not in that background. Here is another image, and if you compare it with the one you just saw, this looks tremendously sharper. But this is also a moving picture. All of those people are moving. They're not actors. They are actual street people. This is from an artwork called Street, created by an artist whose name is James Nares. If you just write down Nares, N-A-R-E-S, Street, and you do a search for that, you can come up with a video and see a portion of the artwork, a couple of minutes worth. The whole artwork is about an hour. And what he did was shoot with a high-speed camera out the side window of a vehicle moving at about 30 miles an hour down the street. And then he slowed down the images, and this is the result. And you can just see this tremendous sharpness. If you look at the video, it'll look sharper than probably anything you've seen, and you go, wow, you know, it's that 4K. But it isn't. It was shot with just HD resolution. So, what do viewers think about increasing frame rate? Well, here are some tests done by the European Broadcasting Union. These were revealed at the International Broadcasting Convention last September. And this time, they show a full grade of improvement for a doubling of the frame rate. And pretty consistent all the way out to 240 frames per second. So a full grade of improvement for a doubling means 2 times the data rate per grade of increase versus the 4K improvement being 16 times the raw data rate. And again, I emphasize this is the raw data rate, not the compressed data rate. I'll mention a little bit about compression in a moment. So the bang for the buck seems to be much better for having the higher frame rate. You're getting not only increased temporal resolution, but you're getting increased dynamic resolution. Now here is a different subject. This is a headline that appeared in Variety at the end of last year. Dolby's high dynamic range TV tech delivers a bigger wow than UHD. Stunning new image tech could be the killer app for next generation TV with or without Ultra HD. And they're using the Ultra HD term to mean 4K. Now, I pretty much agree, except I wouldn't restrict this to Dolby. There are 4 organizations who are working on high dynamic range systems. There is Dolby, there's Philips, there's the BBC, and there's Technicolor. Now, what does this high dynamic range mean? Well, here's an image shot at a ski lift during the spring or summer, looks like. And you can see some of the trees outside the ski lift. You can't really see much detail out in the distance because that's already bleeding out under too much light conditions. But you can't see very much inside the ski lift. So these pictures are courtesy of Joe Kane of Video Essentials. So now let's say that I open the iris a little bit. Well, now I've made the trees bleed out. There's too much light for them. I don't have enough dynamic range, but I can see a little bit more of what's going on inside the ski lift area. And if I make it still brighter, well, now I can see what's going on inside the gondola. But now everything outside is pretty much just blank white. So what if I could include all of those in a single image? Or what if I could reproduce the shiny chrome on a car, the speckle from that, or the bright light that's reflecting off something, or you know, reflection in a mirror or something like that? It really does make an exciting, impressive difference. And at IBC, there was a session that was a debate about whether we need 4K or not, and one of the people on the pro 4K side made a statement that a 4K monitor delivers the best HD you've ever seen. And then I took him over to Ari's booth where they were showing some images shot with the Alexa camera on side-by-side 4K monitors and high dynamic range monitors, and he said, you're right, the HD on the high dynamic range monitor looks better than the 4K. So why is that? Here is a compromise that was done in the early days of HD when Sony first introduced HD Cam. HD goes out to, or 1080 line HD goes out to 1920 picture elements per line. And if you map the modulation transfer function of an HD system, including the lens and the camera, sampling, filters, and so on, you end up with a curve that looks something like this. And depending on whose school of thought you agree with, whether it's the Zeiss school of thought or the RCA school of thought, the sharpness that a person perceives, sharpness is a psychophysical function. It's not a physical property that can be measured. It's proportional either to the area or the square of the area under the curve. So where there's virtually no resolution, we get very high contrast. And as the resolution increases, we get much, much less contrast. So what Sony did when they introduced HD Cam was they did something like this red dotted line. They lopped off the end of the curve. They delivered only 1440 picture elements of resolution, not 1920, which is chopping off a quarter of the resolution. But because there's so little area left under the curve there, even though there was a significant loss of resolution, there was virtually no loss of sharpness, and that's why HD Cam worked. And then Panasonic did something similar with DVC Pro HD, but lopping off even more. They lopped off a third of the resolution, went down to just 1280. Now, if we could restore some of the dynamic range at that high resolution area, then we're doing a tremendous increase in sharpness, whereas if we continue the curve off to the right, we're not picking up very much sharpness at all because the curve keeps getting lower and lower and lower. So dynamic range makes a difference, and if we could do true high dynamic range across the entire range, then we're increasing the sharpness tremendously, which is why the Variety reporter said, wow, you know, it makes this tremendous difference, and why I say it makes a tremendous difference, and why the person who was in favor of 4K who looked at the side-by-side monitors had to admit, yeah, the high dynamic range makes a tremendous difference. Now, how much data rate increase does that require? Well, if you remember back to the Sony Pentagon at the very beginning, if we're simply increasing the dynamic range, if we're simply increasing the range between the brightest and the darkness, then there is no data rate increase that's required. Because bit depth simply determines signal-to-noise ratio as long as at least 1/2 of the least significant bit is noise. But practically, you get contouring because people aren't too careful about how they deal with this. And the contouring is those extra lines. This is supposed to be a nice smooth gradation from black at the top to white at the bottom. The contouring is halved for each additional bit that you add, and it's eliminated when 1/2 of the least significant bit either matches or is less than the noise. So if we go from 8 bits to 10 bits, that would be, sorry, if we go from 12 bits to, from 10 bits, that would be increasing the data rate by 20%. And, you know, I'll be very conservative and say that we're increasing the wow factor or the appreciation of the image by only half a grade. Well, that would be only 4/10 of an increase in data rate per grade of improvement. But it turns out it's even a little better than that. So here are some figures that were shown at the SMPTE Technology Summit on Cinema at NAB 2014. These happen to be from the Swiss Polytechnic Institute in Lausanne, and they're showing like a full grade of improvement going from 100 nits to 400 nits, and then another half grade or something going from 400 nits to 1,000, and then more than another half grade going from 1,000 to 4,000. Now, 4,000 is not something anybody has in their home. 100 is what we're currently using as our reference monitors, and the range between 400 and 1,000, that's basically what people have in their homes. Home TV sets these days tend to be in the 450 to something like 900 nit range. So we are grading pictures or doing color correction, as it's sometimes called in the United States, on pictures using a monitor that has much less dynamic range than what people are watching at home, or much less brightness anyway. And maybe we should be grading those pictures using a higher dynamic range monitor. But there is, unfortunately, interactivity between higher resolution, higher frame rate, and higher dynamic range. So the chart that I'm showing at the bottom is how long it should take something to cross a screen to not have an alias at different frame rates. So if we have only 720p type resolution and we have a frame rate of 120 frames per second, then we can cross the screen in just about 10 seconds with something and not have any aliases. If we go up to 4K of resolution and we're down to just 24 frames per second, then it takes almost 3 minutes to cross the screen and not have any aliasing. And that's why in something like the American Cinematographer Handbook, you'll find various shooting speeds, panning speeds, how slowly you should pan for different frame rates, and so on. Now, the diagram at the right is something that appeared in a paper in the Journal of the Society for Information Display in 2011, and it's for the alias spectra for a sample and hold sync filtered system, and the circle in the center is what you can see. The frame rate increases to the right, and the spatial frequency or the resolution increases heading upwards. And what you want is what I've basically shown in the red oval. I've added the red oval here. That's the desired information, and those other lines that you're seeing are because there's not sufficient frame rate. Well, you can get rid of those other lines by increasing the frame rate, but if you don't increase the frame rate, notice that not all of the lines are as black as all of the other lines. Some of them kind of fade. And the faded line is due to less dynamic range or less contrast. Well, if you increase the contrast by going to higher dynamic range, then you're making those lines more visible, so you're making the motion aliasing more visible. So whether you go to higher spatial resolution or whether you go to higher dynamic range, it seems to demand that you increase frame rate. And you can see this in some of the high dynamic range demonstrations. They'll show something and you'll say, boy, it looks like the motion judder has increased, or the motion artifacts look worse. And they do. So you do need a higher frame rate. Now, how about wider color gamut? Well, there's one company. There are many people who've been working on wider color gamut, but one company is called Genoa Color Technologies, and they came up with display systems that have a greater number of color primaries than just the 3 that we normally use. So they have some systems that add a 4th one, which is yellow, or a 5th one that's cyan, and even a 6th one that's yet another color. And so they can get a greater range of colors than the standard displays give. And so notice in the upper left, this is one of their demonstrations, and they're showing a supposedly typical display on the left and their display on the right, and you can see what the camera is shooting. It's that fabric on the left edge of the card, and notice that the Genoa display is much more accurately capturing what the original colors are. It's more of that purplish color rather than the reddish color. And so you go, wow, that's really important. It's great that we have a wider color gamut. But the picture you're looking at is something you're seeing on a display that, I don't know your particular computer, but I would pretty much guarantee it has only 3 color primaries, red, green, and blue. And so you are able to see that color on your display. So sometimes, like those pictures from the 1928 increase in resolution, sometimes things aren't as bad as they seem. And again, the source material matters very much. Here's another demonstration of incorrect color. This time it's incorrectly decoding the Luma equations. So what I'm showing in the upper left color bars, those are correctly decoded. The color bars to the right of them are incorrectly decoded, and putting those one on top of the other, you can certainly see the color errors. The yellow is different, the cyan is different, the green is very different, the magenta is a little different, the red looks very different, the blue is a little different. But look at some real-world pictures down at the bottom. The one in the center is the way it's supposed to look. The one on the left is misdecoded in one direction. The one on the right is misdecoded in the other direction. Yeah, maybe one of them looks a little bit more orange, and the other one looks a little bit more yellow, but it's not something that makes that much of a difference. And I have to say that in all of the demonstrations I have seen of wider color gamut, that's not the thing that's going to have consumers running up and saying, ooh, 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 that's what we want. So I think higher frame rate, higher dynamic range make the biggest differences, and then higher resolution after that, and also immersive sound makes a big difference. So here was a summing up of the SIMPI technical conference, last year. This is by the executive director of SINTI. It appeared in the SINTI journal in the November-December issue. And she says that the overwhelming response was that faster and better pixels are more desirable than more pixels. More pixels meaning higher spatial resolution, faster pixels meaning higher frame rate, and better pixels meaning higher dynamic range. So here are some comparisons of 4K, higher dynamic range, and higher frame rate in terms of the bang for the buck for the raw bit rate. Higher dynamic range seems to give the biggest bang for the buck, followed by higher frame rate, and trailed significantly by 4K. In terms of compression efficiency, it's actually the other way around. 4K is pretty good because it makes the pictures sharper and there's less change from pixel to pixel, which makes the compression easier. Higher frame rate does the same thing, makes less change from frame to frame and increases the sharpness, and that makes the motion vector analysis easier. Higher dynamic range, you don't get any benefit from it, so as far as compression is concerned, you may be better off with the 4K and higher frame rate than with the higher dynamic range. But fortunately, higher dynamic range is not that big a data rate increase to begin with, even raw. Freedom from lens issues, higher frame rate has no lens issues whatsoever. Higher dynamic range, maybe some lens issues. 4K, tremendous lens issues. Freedom from motion artifacts, higher frame rate is the best thing. And then higher dynamic range and 4K do show you motion artifacts. But how about storytelling? Now, a lot of people have complained about the Hobbit movies when they've seen them in 48 frames per second instead of 24, that there's something unnatural about it. Well, it's certainly something different. And maybe it's just something different. Maybe it's just something that we haven't gotten used to yet, but maybe there's something psychologically going on. When we hear a telephone call in storytelling, we don't listen to it as a regular telephone call, which these days sounds crystal clear. We listen to it as a filtered telephone call, or it sounds something like this. So we know it's not ordinary talking. Or when we have a shot of somebody looking through binoculars, we see that kind of figure-8 pattern, which is not what you should have when you're looking through binoculars. It should be not like that, which means the binoculars are not set right. So maybe some work still to be done on the storytelling aspect. But why are we pushing for 4K? Well, here's something from Brian Mark Walter of the Consumer Electronics Association. This is what the TV set manufacturers are doing. As far as resolution is concerned, they're ready to deliver 4K sets now. As far as higher frame rate, higher dynamic range, bit depth, and colorimetry, they're not ready to give you more now. So I just leave you with one final picture from Pete Luday, shot at the Consumer Electronics show this year. 4K, there are already manufacturers who are pushing 5K. And at that, I will be happy to entertain any questions that you might have. You can type in any questions that you have. Not seeing anything yet. I have overwhelmed you. And I apologize for that. I do encourage you to try to see things for yourself. Again, I cannot possibly show you what you're going to experience yourself. I encourage you to look at 4K things. I strongly encourage you to take a look at James Nares's Street to see the effect of dynamic resolution. I think that's one of the easiest ways to appreciate dynamic resolution, and it is available for free on the web. Just enter James Nares and Street. And I encourage you to see some of the higher dynamic range demonstrations, and also to look at the motion artifacts when you see those as well. By the way, that's a big concern, particularly in movie theaters, which is where The Hobbit has been seen, about the dynamic range there, whether that's going to screw up the way that people see motion. So still hanging on to see if there are any questions. I do not see anything appearing in the pane yet. And again, when people approach you about 4K, ask them about the long lenses, if long lenses are something that you use in your forms of production. Okay, probably have time for one question if somebody gets it in. The webinar will be over in less than 3 minutes.